G'day. I've got another series of things that I'd like to start putting up on YouTube, another series of presentations that is based around current affairs and affairs of immediate history that bear on our current situation. These will primarily be of a geopolitical, political, economic, religious, biblical and spiritual nature, as well as examinations of technology or reviews of technology and other forms of science that impact our lives. So basically whatever's coming across my desk, that's what I'd like to call it, across my desk. A lot of stuff comes across my desk. In fact, just the other day I downloaded from my phone my screenshot folder which I can show you. Let's have a look at it. Onto my PC where I can store it, have a copy of it stored on my hard drive. This is actually one of the screenshots looking at the effects of cannabis and cannabinoidal CBD and Pt.1 THC in cannabis, and the effects that it has on your body and your health. Very good. Catch this. There's an article here a bit further on. You can see that one. That's part of an article that I screenshotted. That's the test that's where it actually came from. So it's actually a legitimate white paper. But anyway, I didn't want to get into all this, but just to give you an idea of why I'm doing what I'm doing. And starting an Across My Desk series. So this is one of the things that came across my desk. And that article actually says clearly that CBD has indication, actually promotes autophagy, which has the effect of removing misfolded proteins. One of the things it does is remove misfolded proteins from your DNA and from your cells. Misfolded proteins are actually can be caused by prions. And anyone who knows anything about what I believe about the effect of the medical interventions that were given to people who were supposedly suffering from COVID-19 and what COVID-19 itself actually is. You can find clear statements of that on my Telegram page, but I've also said it publicly in other places. I will reiterate it by showing the actual material that I've got at some point that has led me to this conclusion. But it's a known effect of prions that they cause misfolded proteins. And the prion disease that they talk about is so deadly because it causes misfolded proteins in the brain, which can then have the effect of actually causing neural dysfunction, leading to neural malfunction and neural atrophy, meaning it kills you through a form of brain death. And that is caused by misfolded proteins. So CBD, in that article that I just scrolled to, shows clearly that it is actually then an effective fighter against certain types of prionic infections, as well as certain forms of cancer. The one that's mentioned in the studies is melanomas, which a lot of Australians suffer from. And I don't believe that it's altogether caused by the sunlight either. I think the environmental causes have to do with certain carcinogenic or precursor carcinogenic pathogens and biological entities that enter our body through our contact with the environment, not just the sunlight. Exposure to the outdoors, exposure directly to plants and water and animals that have been outdoors a lot. Also the food that we eat. There's a level of exposure, I believe, in the food that we eat and in the water that we drink from the town water system, if you're crazy enough to do that, or that you shower in. It's actually hard because of certain geoengineering projects that have been undertaken by the Australian government for over 70 years at this point, and are only on the increase, basically. Those geoengineering projects have actually contaminated just about all of the environment that we interact with outdoors. Yeah. Which is a real problem. So you need to be able to protect yourself from these things. Pathogens and carcinogens, or precursors of those things, which are triggered by combination with other forms of biology or electromagnetic interference. That is actually shown, electromagnetism is shown to have a profound effect on the body's cellular and DNA structure and responses, as well as nervous system responses, both the automatic nervous system and the directly wired conscious nervous system. The amount of EMF saturation that we're exposed to every day in our modern lives is way, way beyond what is considered anything near a safe limit. Even these screens emit EMF radiation, and your phone itself is actually a node or a receptor point that will receive and concentrate EMF radiation. Bluetooth, having Bluetooth earbuds in all the time, man, or even for a little while, is exposing you to an abnormally high level of EMF radiation into the very place, into the last place that you want it, which is directly into your head. And you notice that they go in your ears, which are very close to your temporal veins, right? That feed into your cranial vascular system. Bad idea. Bad idea. I can show you the research on 5G and the sort of waves it emits, and what the nanocore system, which is at the core of the 5G rollout, what that is capable of achieving in regards to integration with bodily functions. They're also using what they call directed beam technology and directed beam tunneling to give you a much more stable, specifically personally focused bandwidth tunnel and access to high-speed data streaming via the 5G network, which is a short millimetre wave network, which is actually microwave. And microwave weapons, anyone who was at the Freedom Front on the 12th of February knows what the effect of those sort of ADS, active denial system type weapons, can actually produce, even in small doses. For anyone who's not aware of what happened there, the police used those weapons against us. and many people went away either sick with COVID-like symptoms, flu-like symptoms, or had evidence of radiation burns on their face and mouth and other parts of their bodies. Mild radiation burns coming up as almost like a pussy sore, almost like a cold sore, but different. Some people went to their local doctors and were diagnosed. Some of them reported that the doctors diagnosed them, couldn't understand how, but were showing symptoms of mild radiation burns. So yeah, electromagnetic frequency radiation, microwave radiation. Yeah. As a direct result of the AFP using ADS type systems against the people on the 12th of February 2022 in front of Parliament House. So all this stuff I've documented. It all comes across my desk. Most of it is I've taken screenshot records. I started doing that toward the end of 2020 when I started researching a lot of this stuff for my own benefit, mainly so that I could make an informed decision about what to do concerning the COVID mandates and the mandating of certain invasive and DNA altering medical interventions that were soon to be thrust upon the people of the Commonwealth of Australia. So I wanted to make an informed choice, so I did the research, man. And I researched and I realised by the end of 2020 that I needed to screenshot a lot of that research because I couldn't necessarily count on the fact that I'd be able to pull it up again at some future point. I'd read information that indicated that the government would try to clamp down on the free access to data and information and research over the internet that did not necessarily coincide with the current government narrative or the narrative from their advisory sources and consultancy stakeholders. So I figured it was actually wise to take a hard copy of those things. I downloaded some files, some web pages as PDFs, but in the end I realised probably the easiest ones to verify their legitimacy because of the timestamps and the metadata is just taking screenshot JPEG or PNG files, contain all the metadata to show whether they're rigid. You can tell from the metadata whether they have been altered in some way, unless someone deliberately tries to cover their tracks on that. So just taking screenshots is one of the best ways to substantiate the validity of your data as well, that it's actual, that you haven't just produced it using AI at this point, but before that people were using things like Photoshop to mock up, false data and make it look like it was real. But now you've got the extra level of AI, which is able to manipulate data and make it look like it's still the real thing. Deep fakes, they call them. So, having said all that, let me take you back to my screenshots folder. There it is, screenshots. And in this folder, there's over 12,000 screenshots that I copied from this very folder here that I copied last week onto a hard drive on my PC. That PC remains disconnected from the internet, man. The best way to stop people hacking your machine is what a guy that I used to know that worked for the government as a IT consultant many years ago came up with a system of infallible security for the ATO, and that system he called air gap. Now that's not as infallible now as it used to be, but generally speaking, if you have a computer that is just, or a server, or a terminal connected to a server that is not in any way even hardwiring, so you actually need just a single unit. Well, I've discovered research now and certain techniques that they have that even override air gap. But back in the day when he came up with it, which was about 25 years ago, they didn't necessarily have access to this sort of technology that I've discovered that can actually overcome the air gap thing. But it actually requires it requires a certain amount of foreknowledge of the thing that you're trying to hack as well. But they can actually now track your movements and your interactions on the internet simply by monitoring the modulation of the frequencies in the overhead power lines, high voltage lines even, that your electrical system is connected to. So they're not even hacking your Wi-Fi, they're actually hacking the electrical frequencies of the exchange of flow of electrons between what's going through the wires outside and what's coming into your house and being used, and the effect that it has on the current flow of the overall electrical system that is being carried in the wires outside. They have that technology, man. I've actually seen it. I got it. That's one of the things that came across my desk. That's why I want to make this video, because these series of videos, because there's a lot of stuff that comes across my desk that I've been watching for a long time and deliberately looking for, because of certain things that tipped me off to them years ago in some cases. And I've been watching some of this stuff for years and collecting data like this on some of this stuff for years at this point. So I've probably got over 20,000 screenshots of data that I've collected and is stored on my hard drive, which is protected, immediately protected, except from what I just told you about. But generally it's protected from infiltration by not being connected at all to the internet, and everything's stored on local hard drives within the machine itself. So no network connection, wired or wireless whatsoever, to anything outside of what's actually on the PC motherboard. And that's probably the safest way to store your data, although, as I said, they can tell what you're doing on YouTube by what's actually going on in the current flow of the overhead power lines that are near your house, that your system is connected to the grid by, your own house system is connected to the grid by. That's some pretty, and that once again comes through an understanding of quantum physics or quantum mechanics, and how electromagnetic frequencies are affected. And being able to, through the ability of AI to process minute detail accurately, and fairly large quantities of it, which has only been exponentially expanded with quantum AI. Yeah. They now have a system, software system, by which they can measure your activity on YouTube. So it's important to protect your data. And if you just have it on a machine that can easily be accessed by contact with a phone, through Bluetooth or wireless connection, Wi-Fi connection, you can touch devices and they have the ability to transfer data from one device to the other without any physical connection. Right? They have apps to do that. Consider then that your phone, especially if you install one of those apps, your phone can then be actually used. And some of that stuff now comes pre-installed on Android operating systems, especially Google-based directly Google-based Android operating systems. Comes as a pre-installed function, right? That's actually then accessible to a third party who can then use it to scan your equipment, your other technology like your laptop or your PC or whatever, where you could be storing data that might be of interest to them. That's something else to consider. So I'm making this series across my desk because I just get so much data across my desk. And a lot of it is useful, and I will try to give at least a brief commentary on the things that I show. But I wanted to show you this as the first one. So 2 days ago, there was this article posted by the Middle East Eye. And basically a lot of this stuff will just be, I give a lot of response to things at the moment on YouTube. I've been taking the time to actually write a proper response to things that I consider important enough to speak about, or that I have the appropriate response for at the time that I find the article or whatever. So this one was from the Middle East Eye, dated 2 days ago. Today, you can see, is Monday the 16th of December. So 2 Israeli soldiers have been unable to travel to Australia after being asked to complete an extensive 13-page form typically required for military personnel involved in war, according to the Israeli newspaper Ynet. The siblings, Omar Berger, 24, and Ella Berger, 22, along with 4 other family members, applied for visas 2 months ago. While the rest of the family received quick approval, Omar and Ella were told to complete the lengthy document. The form included questions about their involvement in physical or psychological abuse, their roles as guards or officials in detention facilities, and whether they had participated in war crimes or genocide. This follows a November ruling from the International Criminal Court, which, mind you, wouldn't even send an investigator to look at a submission that had been made by Sanjeev Sablock, who was a high-ranking Minister of Finance in the Dan Andrews government during the COVID-19 lockdowns of 2020 and 2021. He actually sent internal emails to key officials within that government, and also to Dan Andrews and Brett Sutton themselves, questioning some of what they were doing in light of the necessity to do it and its implication on the people's human rights of Victoria, and also began to call attention to the facts of the ramifications of the interventions that they had introduced into the community. And it was not long before he was able to see significant negative impacts on people in various ways as a direct result of the policies and medical interventions that the Dan Andrews government forced upon the people of the state of Victoria in Australia. So Sanjeev Sablock, having been blocked by his own political party, so he was a Minister of Finance in Dan Andrews' cabinet, basically. I shouldn't say cabinet, but within the top echelon of their the Victorian government administrative structure. And he had access directly by email internally to Dan Andrews, Brett Sutton, and to most of the key ministers who he confronted with these things, with the facts, and asked questions and tried to give some reasoning as to why they shouldn't be doing what they were doing, all of which fell on deaf ears. And when he realised that he was being basically blackballed by his own team, he quit the government, resigned, and then actually worked like a madman to prepare a document, a submission to the ICC, the same International Criminal Court we're talking about in this article, prepared a document to the ICC that outlined the physical, psychological, emotional and mental harm that was being done to the people of Victoria as a direct result of the policies that Dan Andrews' government had. And Dan Andrews himself was very vocal in putting forth and maintaining through all sorts of gaslighting and veiled threatening in his public press conferences to try and justify the way that the government was treating the people of Victoria at that point. Victoria has since gone down in history as being the most radically affected and the most radically censored state in any country during. When I say censored, I'm not just talking about media censorship. I'm talking about their lives, their daily lives, the routine of their daily lives being completely censored and enforced with violence and brutality where coercion and manipulation didn't work, to force them into a completely unnatural way of living and a completely improportionate response to the level of threat that was posed to them by the supposed COVID-19 outbreak in Victoria. Right, so you need to read that document, man. It's Sanjeev Savlok's submission to the ICC. Just Google that into your search bar and you'll be able to download a PDF of that document. I do believe is still available on the website. If you can't find it, call me or message me down below and I will send you the PDF copy that I have of it. I have several PDF backup copies of that document. That was sent to the ICC. I followed up on that and found that the same ICC that is going after Netanyahu And for some reason, it seems to be, by extension, all Israeli military personnel. I don't know how the ICC ruling against Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant actually affects individual military personnel in the IDF. But as you'll see from this article, as I started reading there, you'll see that somehow Australia's response to IDF soldiers that are seeking entrance into Australia, even on a holiday visa, are now subject to some insane scrutiny, where they're even being asked whether they've been part of genocide or war crimes. Right, and that is justified. You can see the justification for the Australian government doing that seems to be this ruling by the ICC against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. But it doesn't say IDF soldiers, right? It names 2 individuals, but every IDF soldier is now being scrutinised as though they were Netanyahu or Yoav Gallant, right? In the ICC's eyes, this is the only justification that that has been brought forth in this article to back that up. And that same ICC, man, this is a point I'm getting to. This is a sort of hypocrisy you're dealing with in these people, mate. And it's disgusting. It's absolutely it is the most shameful and disgusting hypocrisy that I've ever seen, including religious hypocrisy, which is shameful and disgusting in itself. But this is just as bad, if not worse, than the worst religious hypocrisy that you can think of. Because this same ICC actually sent back their response to Sanjeev Savlok. I read that submission. There was enough solid evidence in that submission to create at least an investigation, a criminal investigation, or a preliminary investigation to see whether there was a level of criminality involved in what Dan Andrews did to the people of Victoria and his government did to the people of Victoria during the COVID-19 responses, through their COVID-19 responses during 2020 and 2021. So the answer from the same ICC was that there was not enough evidence for them to even send an investigator out. And that's their first step, is to send out a private or independent investigation team to actually investigate the claims that are being made, to once again to see whether there is a breach of criminality or a breach of the Nuremberg Code that would allow them to build a case and prosecute the person. They said, no, there's not enough evidence. I absolutely disagree with that ruling, having read the document myself. And I encourage anyone who disagrees with me about that to read the document for themselves and make up their own mind, instead of just following some news media or left-wing narrative party line. And they said that they referred Sanjeev Savlok back to the local courts. Well, the local courts had already been presented with filings against Dan Andrews, and filing of proceedings against Dan Andrews for several things, and none of them seemed capable or willing to bring about those proceedings in any, and actually try Dan Andrews in any real way. Hence Sanjeev Savlok's necessity to go to the ICC, which he told them. He said, I can't, basically he says, we can't get justice. We can't even get a look in here at home. Our last resort is to go internationally to the international criminal courts, because the local courts and the state and federal court would not touch it, would not take it seriously, would not allow the process to continue within the Australian court system, or judicial system, I should say. So clearly they were protecting their own, as they always do. Hence he tried to go above them to a court that had an international jurisdiction, but they just rejected him and referred him back to the local courts, which is your classic bureaucratic circular loop, right? Internal feedback loop that just keeps you running around and around in circles. So I have to, having witnessed that in real time, I have to then consider the credibility of the ICC and its findings. Honestly, I have to question the credibility of the ICC and its findings, and also have to wonder whether the ICC is nothing more than an extension of the UN, and that it does share a certain bias due to a globalist agenda or a globalist ideology that is well rooted in organisations like the UN and the WHO and the WMF, World Monetary Fund, and the BIS, Bank of International Settlements, and the WEF, World Economic Forum, etc. So yeah, just how compromised is the ICC and how much bias is there in its judgments. And if you look at anything to do with how to overturn a legal proceeding against you, one of the ways of doing so is actually by proving bias on behalf of the adjudicating body or individual. Right, and there just seems to be, I have to ask how much bias is actually in the ICC, knowing the way it operates and having seen the way it responded to an honest plea for a further investigation that had enough, more than enough documented evidence to at least trigger an inquiry into whether there was whether there was need to investigate further because of criminality that could be involved in the actions of the people or corporations or entities under investigation. Glenn Floyd, who was actually a consultant on the UN in the UN judicial system as a advocate, as a human rights advocate. So he actually worked inside the UN in their legal system for a period of time. He actually made a submission to the local police department, Moreland Police Department, to Detective Inspector Rizzo of the Moreland Police Crimes Unit, on behalf of the people of the state of Victoria, and brought forth the criminal charges from our own criminal code that Dan Andrews and Bretton Sutton were both in breach of. He never received, as far as I know, the police refused to investigate or inquire any further into that. They managed to deflect his first letter, but the second letter had more specific and more simple and provable charges in it, and he got no response from that, I believe, except a negative response, as in they couldn't explain it away, but they wouldn't action it either. Those documents you can find if you actually search Glenn Floyd submission to Moreland Police Department on behalf of the people of not just Victoria but the whole of Australia. But the charges were brought directly against Brett Sutton, and they were from our own criminal code, and you can see clearly that they were actually in breach of the stated code, and he proved that in the second document that he sent, to which they had no response other than no response. Yeah. So there's something very wrong with the judicial system. So I'd like you to call that to mind when you consider that, you know, the International Criminal Court says this or that. At this point, I believe the International Criminal Court is in dire need of proving its unbiasedness and the integrity of its determinations. So, to continue, how long have we gone? Probably too long. Anyway, I'll just finish this up quickly and read my response, and that'll be it. And that'll be my first edition of Across the Desk. So, following the November ruling, International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity over atrocities committed since 7th of October last year. Ella, who was granted a week's leave from her military duties, decided to return to Israel after the delays, while Omar, a reservist, remains in Thailand awaiting a resolution. Australia's Department of Home Affairs insisted that no special treatment was given to Israeli citizens amid the ongoing conflict. A spokesperson explained that the additional paperwork is a routine procedure sometimes requested for individual applications, and highlighted that 11,000 Israeli visas had been approved over the past year. Aaron Berger, a family representative, strongly criticised the delays and suggested they reflected Australia's increasingly antagonistic approach toward Israel amid its ongoing war in Gaza. Why are we subjecting friendly allies to war crimes investigations, he said. Yeah, especially when those particular soldiers weren't named in the ICC indictment against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. The incident follows a similar case involving former Israeli Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked, who was denied a visa in November over fears of incitement. But I don't see, even in the left-wing media, I don't see any reports of Israelis gathering together to incite anything. publicly by way of protest or denunciation, other than to speak plainly to reporters or interviewers who take the time to garner their opinion of current events that directly affected the Jewish community in Israel. I do, on the other hand, see people that are pro-Hamas, pro-Islamic Jihad, radicalised Muslims, and pro-terrorist organisation supporters. And that's not just me saying they're terrorist organisations. They're actually being classified as terrorist organisations by the Australian government. Right, Hezbollah and Hamas and ISIS and the Taliban and certain other members of the Shia jihadist Iran-based caliphate-style Sharia law promoting individuals. I see those people in the news all the time, even on left-wing government propaganda media outlets. So to say that they feared incitement through this man who was a former justice minister of Israel, that somehow he would incite trouble here in Australia, seems to be completely unfounded to me, judging by what's actually being shown on both the right and left-wing news media outlets, mainstream media outlets. The left wing being generally pro-government in its narrative and the way and the articles of news which it actually presents. Right. So there's just more hypocrisy there, man. There's just blatant hypocrisy staring out at you every time you look at what's happening with this situation. Right, so we come to the comments. And I want to read you some of other people's comments to get a general idea of what the tenor of the comments are concerning this article. Our friendly allies are committing war crimes. They should be investigated. Arrest them and send them to a proper court. Why are we subjecting allies to war crimes trials? Why are our allies committing war crimes? It is terribly unjust for my holiday to be delayed because I was a participant in a genocidal crime. I mean, the soldiers should be arrested, but it is a good first step to deny them entry to other countries. But with victims, this is what every country should do. Bravo, Australia. Every country should do the same. Notice how he didn't deny the war crimes, only asked why friendly allies were being investigated. They should be arrested. Denying them visas isn't enough. And they ask why. No, seriously, the audacity, the entitlement. The guys think they really can do whatever the fuck they want because both are allies. Okay, so if my friend commits murder, I need to cover it up. Bullshit. Well, depends how good a friend you are, I guess. I actually had this discussion with one of my friends one day, a close friend of mine. And it depends, I guess it really depends on your friendship. So that's a general gist of the air of the comments and the tone of the comments that were coming back from that article. So these are my comments. I put two because the first one, which is a longer one here, I wasn't sure that it went through because it didn't immediately appear in the comment section, so I put in another shorter comment just to make sure that what I had to say was heard. So this is my shorter comment. Australian government equals compromised, woke hypocrites. I stand by that. They've proved that to me over and over again. They scrutinise Israeli people but let other Middle Eastern people into our country without proper vetting, who then turn out to be radicalised Muslims, jihadists and terrorist sympathisers, then have to backtrack on their immigration policies and re-examine the people they just let slide in under the radar. Right? That's how hypocritical this country is at this point, and how compromised and woke it is, and how much it is actually run by UN and left-wing agenda outside of the interest of the Australian people and the immediate safety of the Australian society. Australian government sides against Israel in the UN, but embraces Chinese and Iranian regimes that have a public record of mass slaughter and genocide of their own people, and not just since last year, but going back as a greater part of their history throughout the whole length of their regimes in their respective countries, China and Iran. Now, if you don't know anything about that, then you've been living under a rock, man. A nice pink polka dot spotted rock, and probably sitting there chewing on some sort of hallucinogenic fungus. Right? Go and Google it. Just Google those things. Mass slaughter and genocide committed by Chinese and Iranian regimes. Right? CCP regime. Anyone remember Tiananmen Square? Right? Recently they were called to account for the genocide of the Uyghurs, I believe it was. But there was no UN or there was no UN intervention against China for the genocide of its own people in its own nation state territory. What? So if you're a completely totalitarian, dictatorial, tyrannical, left-wing, communist, socialist technocracy, you can just kill your own people and no one's going to raise an eyebrow, because that's just what we expect you to do, because you've stated that you're this sort of thing, right? What justification is being used there? How is there any sort of equity between the way Australia views China and Iran and the way that they view Israel? Why haven't they spoken up? I mean, you regularly have Iranian men and women standing outside the Parliament House in Canberra in Australia on a regular basis, right? They try to make it there on a regular basis and actually call for the Australian government to do something about the amount of mass killings, torture and imprisonment and sexual abuse that's taking place by the Iranian regime to the people of Iran, right? And that is all over the media at this point, either left-wing or right-wing media. You can find stories of what's actually happening there, or you can get off your backsides and go to the Parliament House and talk to some of the actual people that have been the direct victims of that sort of abuse, that have survived and have escaped Iran and still bear the scars, both externally and internally, from the abuse that they have received from their own government, right? Which in most cases is exactly like China: abduction, re-education, imprisonment, rendition, torture, sexual abuse for the women and for the men, right? That's their standard way of dealing with anyone who doesn't agree or toe the line with the tyrannical dictatorships narrative. And yet Australia is completely silent on those issues, but is jumping up and down on the bandwagon when it comes to Israel. Right, that is a massive disconnect. From equity and equality by the Australian government. And it's just blatant hypocrisy. So, Australian government sides against Israel in the UN but embraces Chinese and Iranian regimes that have a public record of mass slaughter and genocide of their own people. You cannot claim the moral high ground while you are cuddling up to the devil. Absolute hypocrisy. In the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, Matthew 23:24, ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel, ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can you escape the damnation of hell? And that's where I'll leave it.